All right, so before we kind of get into things here, I will host an online quiz after today's class. They'll have just a couple questions, kind of get a gauge of how we're understanding the current kind of material with the labor market. Might be a question over the reading that I also will get posted up there as soon as class is over. That will kind of one of the reads that we'll go over on Thursday. So I think that I've got 5 people left that I don't have their data sets to you yet. So if you haven't heard from me, so if you're one of those 5, I also have emailed you and let you know. So if you haven't heard from me and you haven't gotten data, send me an email. Maybe I somehow, I don't know, didn't hit send on it, but I've got checked down that at least other than those 5 that I've emailed, I should have kind of gotten data to 20. If not, something might have fallen through the crack. One time I emailed someone, I forgot the attachment. So just let me know so we make sure that kind of everyone has something up to this point. If you do decide, I don't know, within the next week or two, like you want to change something, that's fine. If you need a little bit different data or something, let me know. I can try to let you know if it's something doable that I can kind of help you, get real quick. But otherwise, we should start kind of working on those projects a little bit. So we've spent some time going over kind of the lit review, just kind of showing you how to use Google Scholar, need a couple references there. We've started looking at Excel a little bit, so we'll start doing that more. This Thursday, I'll probably also bring in some stuff and we'll talk about how we do some different stuff in Excel that you might run into, or how we use that regression analysis to maybe make some certain statements. Other than that, I will also, I don't know if I'll get it posted this afternoon. I want to make sure that I kind of go over it one more time, but I've got the next homework pretty much ready to go. After today, we'll kind of have started getting through enough material where you can at least start chipping away at it. We won't have covered everything that'll be on that homework yet, but it'll probably have be due 2 weeks from when I assign it, and then you can kind of work on it as we cover the material. Okay. Any questions from me before we kind of get going here? Okay. All right. So we've been talking about kind of the labor market, and we have talked about unions before, but we'll think about 2 different types of unions. We'll talk a little bit more about how the unions operate, get into monopsony power as well, and then maybe how kind of we see negotiation play out. So we generally have 2 types of unions, right? So we'll call them craft and industrial. Right? So, the naming isn't as important as what they do. So craft unions basically set a certain membership, right? So this would be maybe they only accept 5,000 people, right? And then that kind of becomes their vertical supply curve, right? Once they hit that membership, there's no more supply past that point. Okay? Industrial unions are going to be the unions that I've kind of showed you already in the past in this course, which is that they act as though they're a monopoly in the labor market, right? And so we kind of have seen how this one plays out, but I'll show you how craft unions would really be pretty much the same thing. Both of them kind of lead to potentially lower number of workers, but also increased wages, right? It kind of depends on where the craft union sets their membership, whether it's above or below, the old equilibrium. But if they're doing it efficiently, they should kind of have the same effect. And I'll give you an example where they can have the exact same effect. Okay. So let's use some kind of formulas, and we'll try to kind of tackle what we've done with unions before, but now put some actual equations to it. So let's say I've got my demand function. So this is the demand for labor, and here's my supply of labor. So usually, and just completely go to the dot cam yet, but I'll blow this up in a second. Usually what we're thinking about for demand or supply equations is something like this, right? And then the slope would be, obviously for demand is negative, for supply would be positive. Well, now our price is wages, right? And you can think about it as kind of our quantity of labor here is that Q. Okay? So we've got a supply and a demand curve. So we can kind of draw this visual as we work through this problem with the formula. So here's our quantity of labor and our wage. Our demand curve for labor starts at, right, when quantity is 0, the wage would be 60,000. So at a quantity of 0, that wage would be 60,000. That's essentially, right, our intercept. And then we have our supply curve for labor. And when quantity is zero there, the wages start at kind of 10,000. Think about it as like to supply that first unit of labor, you need to at least offer $10,000 as the wage. Okay. So we can find this equilibrium, but I'll kind of work through how we do this. So the slide like has the answers, but I want to kind of give you a little bit better idea as to why. So we know the equilibrium point without a union or without monopsony power is going to be at this point right here, okay? Where the supply curve for labor is equal to the demand curve for labor. But what will those values be? Right? Well, we had that supply curve. No, this was the demand curve, sorry. The demand curve for labor was what, 6,000 minus, and I want to say it was 4Q. Was that what it was? Okay. So 4Q, and we'll set that equal, so this is our demand. We'll set that equal to the supply for labor, which was just 10,000, and I believe that was just plus Q. So now it's just a little bit of algebra, right? So I can move this 4Q over to the side, subtract 10,000 from both sides, and what I'm left with is what, 50,000 is equal to 5Q. Divide both sides by 5. All right, and I get that the equilibrium quantity here would be 10,000, unless I did my math wrong here somewhere, but I think I got it. So once I know the equilibrium quantity, I can figure out what the equilibrium wage is by plugging this quantity into either demand or supply equation, right? Because they're both equal to each other at this point. If I look at this, supply would be pretty easy. If I plug this back into my supply curve, right? I would get that wage is equal to 10,000 plus 10,000, or the equilibrium wage is 20,000. Okay. So it's just like we would with regular supply and demand curves. It's just now we're looking at the labor market. Okay. So that's how we can use these equations to solve for that equilibrium price and quantity. Visually, it's where those two lines intersect, which means it's where those two equations are equal to each other. Okay. Any questions there? Or that kind of did the algebra a little sloppy. So if you have questions, let me know. Or keep moving. We'll come back to this because I think I forget the next step. I think I introduced union membership. Okay, so let's say I'm going to go forward here a little bit. Well, we could do this. Let's say union membership limits its number of members to 5,000. So it kind of acts as a craft monopoly. Okay. So we want to limit it to 5,000 players. I'll do the blue will be our craft monopoly. So what they're going to do is say, well, look, basically up to that 5,000, we'll continue to let labor kind of supply be what it is. But then past that point, we're not going to allow there to be any more than 5,000 workers in this industry. Or, maybe the players union says we're not going to, create more, allow there to be more teams, right? We're against that, right? We don't want more players in the league. So our new equilibrium quantity becomes 5,000, right? That's what they've said that. They've set it below what the old equilibrium would be. So that's where we're stuck. However, with a craft union, we should always think about unions should be increasing wages. So if I think about relative to the old equilibrium without a union power, well, now for that 5,000 unit of labor, we know that teams would be willing to pay whatever point we're at on the demand curve. Remember, they'll pay up to the value of those additional wins that player is going to bring in. Right? So we know that to find the new equilibrium wage, we would go up to where we're at on the demand curve at whatever quantity of membership was set by the union. So what is that doing? Well, it's really just plugging 5,000 into my demand curve, right? So I've got my demand curve, which is here. I'm just going to plug that 5,000 into my quantity. So 60,000 minus 4 times 5,000. So I think this is 40,000. I'm doing my math correctly here. So the new equilibrium wage under a craft union would be 40,000. So if you want to think about maybe a wage under a craft union, C, and we'll call the other one I for industrial union. So they're just limiting the membership, and they, as a result, they know that teams would be willing to pay a higher wage for that last unit of labor supply. Okay. Any questions there before we keep moving? Now, if you want to draw this next one, I'm going to draw this in the same graph, but if you don't have enough colors, I would just redraw this, but don't include the craft union. You could just put kind of the old equilibrium points in there, just draw a supply of labor and demand of labor curve. Okay. So if you don't want to put this all on the same graph, just draw out just the supply curve and the demand curve for labor, and we'll kind of start from there. Okay. But I do want to kind of put on the same one just so we can see how a union and a kind of a craft union, industrial union kind of can lead to the same result. So I think the way I have it set here, they won't be the same result, but I can give you an idea about how it could be. So when we've got a union, they're acting like a monopoly, right? The players unionize, the players are supplying the labor, just like when someone sells a good and they're the only person selling it, they're the only supplier. So when they unionize, the workers become the only suppliers of labor. So as a result, the way they maximize their profits for the union, and I might have this drawn incorrectly because I forget exactly what the number is. So let me make sure. I think the quantity is lower. No, it's going to be a little bit higher. So I have to draw this a little bit differently. So scratch this. It's going to end up being something like this. Right? So it's twice as steep. The math is what it is, but I just want to make sure the visual lines up. Okay? So they're going to make their decision to maximize profits for the union based off of a twice as steep marginal revenue curve, right? They're acting like a monopoly. So how does a monopolist set the equilibrium quantity? Well, it's going to be wherever the marginal revenue, remember, supply reflects marginal costs. So wherever marginal revenue is equal to marginal costs. Okay? So I'm going to have to give myself a little bit more room here. Let me see if I can keep all this on here. Can I zoom out anymore? Nope. All right, well, I think I can keep just enough on here. So we're going to need to find where marginal revenue is equal to supply, right? This is going to be the quantity at which will be optimal for the union. So what's our marginal revenue curve? Well, it's going to be the same as demand, right? But twice as steep. So it starts out at 60,000, but instead of having a slope of -4, it's going to have a slope of -8. And then we're going to set that equal to our marginal cost or our supply curve, which was just 10,000 plus Q. So here was supply. So we set marginal revenue equal to supply or our marginal cost. Now it's just a little bit of algebra to solve for what this quantity is. Okay. So if I move things around a little bit, I'm going to subtract 10,000 from each side. I'm left with 50,000. I'm going to add 8Q to both sides. I'm left with 9Q here. So then quantity is just going to be what? 50,000 over 9, which I think is 555 repeated, which is why I had to draw this again, right? So that it slightly intersected that marginal cost curve a little bit higher than what the craft union did. Now you can imagine the craft union, if instead of 5,000, if they had set the membership at 5,555, we'd actually end up at the exact same point as the industrial union arrived at, right? So they can have the exact same effect. I guess, you know, the one nice thing about the craft union is really they're not limited. They could set the quantity wherever they want, right? Now, if they're trying to maximize profits, the craft union should set the quantity at wherever that industrial union would set it at, right? Because that's the profit maximizing point for the union. Well, now that I know the quantity, what is the new equilibrium wage? Well, it's going to be whatever the teams would be willing to pay these players at that quantity. So it's just going to be a matter of plugging that quantity into my demand curve, right? So just like before, where I plugged the 5,000 into my demand curve to come up with the equilibrium wage of a craft union, for the industrial union, I'm just going to go up and what my demand curve was 60,000 minus 4 times this 5,555.
You put it back in the original or the marginal revenue?
So, right, we're trying to find at this quantity where we're at on the demand curve. Yep. So we go back to the original demand curve and plug our quantity in there. Okay. What is this going to be? 37,000 something? I'm going to cheat. 37,777. All right. So if we do that, we get 37,777. And I might be rounding a little bit here. All right, so we can kind of see the craft and the industrial union on the same graph if we wanted to then. Okay. Any questions on that? So no matter how they act, whether or not they're making their decision based off of this profit maximizing twice a steep marginal revenue curve, or they're just setting union membership to have a lower number of workers and then a higher wage, right? Both types of unions can increase the wage, right? It doesn't matter which one we're looking at here, they increase the wage from the original equilibrium, okay? Any questions on this before we keep moving? Okay, so I just wanted to go through an example where we had some equations. I know we've looked at kind of industrial unions, even thought about surplus in the past, but we haven't really kind of worked through an example with some actual equations there. So you could find deadweight loss. I'll do that for you here just to kind of give you an idea since I put the numbers in. So let's do this for the industrial union, right? This is the quantity that they set. So all the surplus that we're losing out on is all those quantities or all those workers or players now that essentially aren't hired, right? So I would need to find the area of this triangle. Well, I've got the base. It goes from 5,555 to 10,000. I don't quite have the height of the triangle because I know it stops here at 3,770. Actually, this is what? I'm missing a 7 here. It's supposed to be 37,777, right? But I don't know the bottom point of this triangle, but how could I find that? Well, it's the point that I'm on at this quantity on my supply curve. My supply curve was just 10,000 plus Q. So what would this point be here? My quantity that I'm currently at. Yeah, just 10,000 plus 5,555. Now I can find the height of that triangle. I've got the base times height times 1/2. Right? So if I'm trying to find deadweight loss here, I've got what? 37,777 minus 15,555. That was the height of my triangle, multiplied by 10,000 minus 5,555 here, and then times 1/2 because it's the area of a triangle. Okay. And make that a little bit easier to see. Okay. Any questions there? Okay. Now, if I look at the craft union here, where would deadweight loss be? Well, they set quantities a little bit lower, so their deadweight loss, right, is going to just be a little bit larger of an area, right? So it's going to be that entire. I would find it, almost the exact same way. It's just instead of being at a quantity of 5,555, I'm at a quantity of 5,000. I could find this point and kind of find the height and the base kind of in a similar method. So I won't draw all that on the same graph to get too confusing, but you can kind of see visually there with that craft union setting a union membership lower than what the industrial union did. It's going to create a little bit more deadweight loss. Okay. But if the craft union wanted to, they could have also set union membership at like 9,000, in which case they can still increase wages, but create a lot smaller deadweight loss, right? They can really go either direction. So this isn't always the case that a craft union has higher deadweight loss associated with it. Okay. Any questions before we move on here? Okay. Okay, if I move back to slides, I need a little more time. All right. Oh, wrong way. All right. So kind of thought about unions. Oops. We could review the idea of monopsonies. We have done it relatively recently, so I'll go through it pretty quick. But remember, when we have monopsony power, which primarily used to operate through kind of the reserve clause, but we also have things now like restricted free agency, which we'll talk about in just a second. So I can think about with just monopsony power. So I've got my supply curve for labor and my demand curve for labor. When we've got unions that can act like a monopoly, they made decisions based off of a twice as steep marginal revenue curve, right? They were trying to maximize profits by choosing the quantity, right? So they're kind of caring about what quantity is going to generate, additional revenue. So this marginal revenue curve. When I'm a monopsony, I'm the only person who is demanding labor. So now for me, I'm not trying to maximize profits. I'm trying to minimize expenses. So that's why the monopsony makes decisions based off of a twice as steep marginal expenditure curve. And it's twice as steep as my supply curve, that what represents my marginal costs, right? Because here, the monopsony is trying to minimize their expenses as opposed to maximize profits. And when I say minimize expenses, they're really trying to minimize the net benefit by choosing what the expense level is going to be. So they now, right, with demand reflecting marginal benefit or the value of the additional wins that players, that's the marginal benefit to the team, they'll kind of set that equilibrium quantity wherever the marginal expenditure curve hits my demand curve or the marginal benefits. But because they're a monopsony, they can get away with saying, well, look, we know that workers or players here would be willing to supply their labor, this quantity of labor, they'd be willing to supply it at a much lower wage than whatever the equilibrium would be. So, and like I said, we can think about this not like just overall, right? Like these are wages, maybe not for every single player. It's like every quality of player would have their own labor market, right? And even if the quantity of labor supply we can think about is not the number of workers, but the number of quality labor hours, right? They could still get away with paying every single player a slightly lower wage if they're able to kind of execute their monopsony power. Now, if we get rid of things like the reserve clause, where we have like unrestricted free agency, well, then that monopsony power kind of goes away. And those are things that are kind of used to try to help the player, right? Because otherwise, the teams are going to be able to kind of keep the wage artificially low. Think about it this way. If I'm paying this player, if I'm a monopsony, I use different colors to make this point. If I'm paying this player a lower wage, right, the actual value of that player, kind of could think about, is wherever I'm at on that demand curve. So the value to the team or the value of the additional wins that player brings in is going to be much greater than the wage the monopsonist pays them. So for the monopsonist, for the teams, that's a great thing, right? I'm getting a lot more value than what I'm paying in, right? My net benefit there is very positive. Okay? Whereas if I'm just at the equilibrium point, well, now the wage is exactly equal to the value of that player to the team, right? So like both parties are kind of net benefits of zero there. They're both indifferent. Okay. Any questions there before we keep moving? Okay. So we've got this result. We've got a problem. We talked about this before, but we didn't really go through the solution, right? The monopsonist, which we know there's generally a lot of monopsony power. Like I said, there's restricted free agency, even if we go back to the reserve clause, thinking about situations like that. And we also see that there's some union power. Every single league has their own union. And the union sets higher wages. The monopsonist is going to set lower wages. So where do the wages get set at, right? Well, we said somewhere in between, but that's not a very good answer, right? So how can we figure out exactly where it's going to be? Well, we can't arrive at a specific value, but we can start to think about if we can narrow down the range of possible values where this is going to be. So we'll think about if both sides couldn't come to an agreement, right? They both want to set wages differently. We start to have things like strikes, lockouts, and even if they come to an agreement, we have bargaining issues. So strikes are going to be when the two sides can't come to an agreement. So the players say, we're going to act like a craft union and set the number of workers at zero, right? We're not going to play. Right? That's a strike. Lockouts are when the teams or the league says, well, we can't come to an agreement. We're not going to, put on any games, right? So both sides need each other, right? The players don't own the stadium. So that's not like they can just play without the team. They guess they could build their own stadium if they wanted to, but that would, come in as a pretty consequential cost. So we have this issue of what bilateral monopoly, right? So you have monopoly and monopsony power, and that monopsony power is like, these teams kind of have a monopoly in the market of providing the games, which results in them having a monopsony in the labor market for workers who are going to provide those games. Okay. So we've got this issue. Oops. So we already said we can kind of figure out what this range is going to be, but where are we at kind of within that range? How do the sides kind of come to an agreement? So the way that unions work is really a combination of like industrial and craft. So they're not necessarily restricting the quantity of labor or kind of the membership there. I guess it's somewhat a byproduct of the number of roster spots times the number of teams. But the players union also does have some say in whether or not there is a new team, right? Whether or not they want to increase or decrease roster sizes. So somewhat they're acting like a craft union, but more often than not, they're going to be proposing wages based off these optimal quantities they were choosing from a twice as steep marginal revenue curve. So they also kind of, like other unions, like electricians, things like that, they represent players that have kind of these special skills. And really the only need for them is the fact that there was monopoly power in this, there was monopsony power in the labor market when it comes to looking at these different sports, right? So the unions were a way to kind of combat this, right? So as opposed to just accepting a lower equilibrium wage, once they unionize, now they can get somewhere within that range of possible wages. Is there anything else I want to say here? This is just kind of, they're unique in that they not only kind of bargain for specific pay, but they're bargaining for different things that the players want in terms of shorter off season or shorter number of preseason games, or other things that the players might want that make their life a little bit easier, right? Provide them with additional benefits. So they're not just fighting for wages; they're fighting for all kinds of things that the players that belong to that union would want. Let's see. We can kind of go through some of this. This is just a little bit. I think I'm kind of leave this contract zone stuff here that I've got. But if we think about different leagues, just kind of see how free agency has played out. The NFL, right, goes back to 1957. And they won a court case. However, the owners kind of didn't follow this, right? They kind of agreed that we're all not going to sign each other's free agents, and so that way we kind of keep our monopsony power, right? Even once the player's a free agent, if no other owner will talk to them, whatever team had them to begin with essentially has that monopsony power. However, in 1960, we kind of had this additional rule, which is that, what was it? If you sign the free agent, the club that you signed the player away from would be awarded an additional player, and the commissioner would get to choose that player. So you can kind of imagine, like, I don't know what players that commissioner is going to choose, is a pretty big risk to go out and sign these free agents. So we kind of have the league kind of, trying to kind of keep the team's monopsony power here. So it does kind of become a trade. Like if the teams, once they had this rule, like we don't truly have free agency, right? But we do allow for almost essentially the trade. If somebody's going to sign this player and I know that then I'm going to be awarded one of their players, well, then we can kind of work out which player it's going to be. And maybe this just kind of starts to operate like a trade, which is okay. It still means that team or players can move the teams that they want to. The only problem is when it's a trade, as opposed to a contract with a player, kind of the player's not getting higher wages. It's the team that's kind of receiving that additional surplus. So it doesn't really solve the problem that, that players aren't going to be receiving as high of wages. And it really wasn't overturned until 1992. So we had this long period where we really didn't have true free agency, or we didn't have no monopsony power in the NFL. NHL and NBA, basically they were almost forced to have free agency in the sense that they had competing leagues, right? And so when I have a competing league, that in and of itself was going to eliminate my monopsony power. If they truly are competing and have the marginal revenue per win, right, that is close to mine such that they're offering comparable wages, well, I don't have any monopsony power anymore, right? Because if I try to give a lower wage to the player, they're just going to go to a team in the other league. And if they offer a slightly higher wage, that player will sign there. Well, then maybe I offer a slightly higher wage, and that kind of would continue with as soon as you have one competing league, you basically got perfect competition, right? Where we're going to kind of compete with each other. So we kind of had that existing both in NHL and NBA. And it's kind of a slightly different, if we look at NFL and MLB, their unions really arose because of player pay issues. Whereas here in the NBA and NHL, they didn't start because of pay or play, right? They already had a competing league to deal with that monopsony power, but they started to kind of prevent kind of a merger, right? So why would the union want to prevent a merger? So I had these two competing leagues, like, so let's say I have the NBA and then I had the ABA. Why would the players not want the NBA and the ABA to kind of merge together? So when we say less bias, let's think about it this way. If I've got competing leagues, that's essentially, I said, as long as we have one other competing league, as long as the marginal revenue per win is comparable, which it was at the time between those two, I've essentially got a perfectly competitive market. Wages are going to be wherever I'm at here, right? Wherever supply is equal to demand for whatever quality of labor. As soon as those leagues merge, how many leagues are now exist? One. So they now have monopsony power. They now can pay the players less, right? So the union started there, not as a result, I guess, directly trying to control wages, but they knew that as soon as those leagues merge, we're going to have monopsony power in our labor market, and we're actually going to end up with lower wages. So slightly different reason, but really they were kind of able to foresee the fact that, well, yeah, we don't want there to only be one employer. Okay. So Major League Baseball, we kind of talked about this before. We had Marvin Miller come in. We had, what was it? Was it Kurt something? Didn't want to go to Philadelphia. Anyway, so Kurt Flood. Does that sound right? So they kind of started for the reason where players weren't free to kind of choose what teams they were able to sign with. And what they've done, and we'll kind of talk about here in a second a little more about arbitration, is we know that we now have union power, but we also have the league has its kind of monopsony power as well, right? So instead of the league and the owners being able to make all the decisions, they now have a panel. So it's got one person from the owners, right, the team owners, one person that the union appoints, and then a third person that they both kind of agree on. So they've created this panel. So when there are issues that arise, right, with player, contract negotiations, that this panel will kind of make a decision on it, but it's got one person from kind of each side as well as one third party. Think about it this way. So we've got this panel, and we first see free agency in 1976 in Major League Baseball. So at this point in time, currently, all of them have kind of a form of free agency. So there's two forms of free agency, restricted and unrestricted. Okay, so you can kind of imagine which one's probably the closest to how we think about pure free agency. Well, unrestricted, right? I can sign with anybody I want, no strings attached. Restricted free agency are things like, maybe teams can say no, like to other teams in their division. Like they don't want you to sign with another team in your division. So there's some restricted free agency where they might have like right of last refusal or something. So we've got kind of two forms. We can think about unrestricted is our, probably what makes, what we would think of first when we think about free agency, which is that you can really sign with any team. There's no restrictions, right? So in Major League Baseball, NBA, NFL, we've got all kinds of different kind of rules. So in NBA, it's after 4 years. Major League Baseball after your first 6 years. NHL is a little bit complex. Kind of depends on the number of years of experience, but also your age and how many games and what position you play. So all we need to know is that there is some form of free agency in each one of these leagues. Okay. Restricted free agency is going to be that the original team has this right of refusal. And so this is essentially like to prevent players from moving within a division. So, if I, let's say Aaron Rodgers, instead of, signing with Green Bay in this offseason, if he was a restricted free agent and tried to sign with the Bears, the Packers would have said no, right? They don't want you moving to another team if you're a good player within their own division. So this is the idea of restricted free agency. So each league has their own rules here, except for Major League Baseball, right? So they don't have any form of restricted free agency, but the other three leagues do. Right? And primarily, kind of for this NBA, it's for the first round picks that really it's the first 3 years, like that you're not able to trade them, but after 3 years, there's a restricted free agency. So let's say someone comes in the league, I draft in the first round, I sign them to a 5-year contract. Those last 2 years of their contract, right after the first 3 years, if they were taking the first round, they're treated as a restricted free agent, the team can actually say no to them leaving and kind of signing with another team. So why might the NBA have done this? What are they trying to do with this type of a rule? So maybe if I'm taking players in the draft, right? The idea is specifically those at the higher end of the draft are going to be getting the best players, right? But they're also probably higher up in the draft because why? I talked about there's a reverse draft order. So they were lower quality teams. So what the NBA is trying to do with something like this is say, well, look, if you take a player and they end up being good, we want to ensure that those lower quality teams can hang on to that player longer. And this would allow that to happen, right? They give them some additional kind of power, which is this restricted free agency, okay? And then once again, the NHL is like a bunch of complex rules, but the idea is similar there, where they're trying to ensure that if a team does get a high quality player, it's less likely that that player is able to leave for a larger market, okay? or a team that will offer a higher wage. We looked at how larger markets can offer higher wages because there was two components of that demand curve, right? And one of them was the marginal revenue per win, which we knew was going to be a little bit higher in large markets. All right. So I'm going to skip ahead a little bit and then we'll come back to this because I wanted to, we were talking about it earlier. Move this here. I don't know why I ended up down below. So we kind of talked about Major League Baseball has this kind of panel, right? These three people who try to make decisions based off of negotiations that go on between the league and the union. So the thing about salary arbitration is we have two parties who are kind of submitting proposals to this third party, right? Who is the arbiter. So, maybe a team and a player are kind of working on a contract. The league or the team, knows they have monopsony power. Players part of the union. They're trying, they know they've got some monopoly power there, but there's still kind of this range that they're going back and forth trying to find something that they both agree on. Okay? Well, the idea of an arbiter is that both sides would say, okay, this is the amount I want. This is the amount that I want to pay that player. Right? So both the team and the player kind of put in their proposals, and this third party looks at them and makes the decision, and both sides agree that whatever this arbiter comes up, decision they make, they'll stick to it, right? So maybe the player wants, I don't know, $5 million. The team only wants to pay them $3 million. They both submit those amounts, and maybe one of them was a little bit closer to what the true equilibrium would have been. So the arbiter goes with that person's proposal. Well, if the arbiter can only choose between the two proposals put up, they can't like split the difference. What would be kind of the optimal strategy to be there then? Right? So let's say, well, let me see. I think I've got all this. So yeah, they all have their kind of their own type, but let's think about if I've got this third party arbitration. So let's say that a player knows that the value to the team is, I don't know, let's say $5 million. That's the value of that player's marginal product of labor. And how do we want to think about this? So the player would like to, well, let's think about this one. Let's say if we were at the equilibrium point, let's give you a visual, kind of this is where that player's value would be $5 million, right? So at the equilibrium point, their valuation to the team would be $5 million. However, we've got some monopsony power that could exist. So the wage that the player could kind of get if there was only monopoly or only union power here, maybe they could set their wage at $7 million. And if we only had kind of monopsony power, the team could actually get away with paying them only $3 million. But both of these exist simultaneous. So if they both propose an amount here, they're both $2 million off of what the actual equilibrium would be if there had been no power that existed. So if I'm the player here, if the team continues to put to the arbiter that they want to get away with only paying me $3 million, and that's $2 million off of what the real value is, but I'm also proposing something that's $2 million above what that equilibrium should be. What might it be optimal for me to do, or maybe to guarantee that the arbiter goes with my proposal? What if instead My proposal is 6 million. Well, now this third party looks at this and says, well, this side had a proposal that was only 1 million off of really what the value should be. The other side has a proposal that's $2 million off. So if I'm a third party trying to choose which one of these wage offerings is more fair to both sides, well, this proposal is a lot closer to what the actual value should be. I'll go with that. So if I know that exists, well, now what is optimal for the team to do? Yeah, 5.5 or whatever it is that I'd be right on the other side, but I could, I was choosing a slightly different value here, but 5.5. Now I know my value is closer, right? I'm only half of it. Well, now what do they do? 5.25, right? And basically, there's going to be an incentive for both sides to give a more realistic offer, right? Now, they're still going to try to go over and under and hope that, there's some more in-depth game strategy we can go into. But the idea is, at least with this third-party arbiter, both sides are somewhat, there's a new incentive to offer something that's a little closer to what that equilibrium wage should be, okay? So that's the idea of these salary arbitrations, final offer arbitration, where they can't impose their own solution, right? Both sides, if they can't split the difference, both of us are going to have an incentive to get closer what that actual value should be, okay? So what's the problem if, do I have a bullet point here? No. So maybe what's another benefit of this final offer arbitration? Let's think about if I don't have it, right? So let's say I still make a proposal to this third party, but they can now split the difference. They can look at both of our proposals and say, let's say we go back to the original 7 million, 3 million. Now we allow the third party to say, well, I can choose my own solution. So if the third party arbiter is given both of these proposals, to split the difference, maybe they say, okay, I'll set, I'm going to split the difference between the two proposals and set the wage that I think is fair as 5 million. So there's like this, if this isn't a possibility, well, now what does it make sense for the player in the union to do? So if I know that they're going to split the difference and we start here, what if the player offers 8 million? Well, now if the difference gets split, right now it's 5.5. So now there's an incentive for this team to say, well, I think I should only have to pay them 1 million. And now the difference would be 4.5. So now there's this incentive for both sides to start proposing solutions that are really far away from what the actual equilibrium should be. So this is why, we really want final offer arbitration, because if we don't allow it, the incentive that was helping us before, right, kind of drawing both sides' proposals closer to what the equilibrium value should be, now that, there's actually incentive to put proposals that are further from where that point should be, okay? Where are we at in time? Oh, okay, we have 30 minutes. So it's kind of interesting is if we look at this final offer arbitration, this is what Major League Baseball uses. I had some numbers, and this was just for a 2-year time period. They had 78 players file to kind of go to this, right? They're in contract negotiations and hit like a stall. And only 6 of them actually went to arbitration. So 78 filed, only 6 of them went. And of those 6, 4 of the players actually, their proposal wasn't chosen. The team's proposal was actually chosen. Okay. So why do you think, I think I've got the question here. So when Marvin Miller suggested that we do this final offer arbitration, and he says this is one of the best things that happened to Major League Baseball players' salaries, well, then why are the majority of them losing? And why do many of the filings not even make it to arbitration? So think about it. As soon as a player files for this arbitration, if the teams did have some monopsony power, they know that once this goes to arbitration, their proposal could not be accepted, right? And so as soon as a player files, there might be a little bit more of an incentive for that team to try a little bit harder to find a deal that works, right? And so that looks like is going on, because if 78 players file, but then 72 of them end up saying, you know what, never mind, we came to an agreement, it must have been that just the filing process was helping out those players, right? So yeah, 4 of the 6 lost here, but it's probably because those are probably some ridiculous cases where even once they filed, the teams tried to come back with a counter offer, and those players are just like, no, right? So this may be some particularly stubborn players or some particularly stubborn teams. It could go either way there. But it does look like, the fact that 78 filings, but then by the time you get to the actual arbitration, only 6 of the cases are left, this must be, causing some change in behavior by the teams. Okay. All right. So the other thing that's what I had here. So the other thing I want to go through is this idea of contract zones today. So this is kind of interesting. And I've got a bunch of bullet points, but I'll go through some examples. So I think it makes a little more sense. And I think I'm going to use the example here, kind of a motivating example. If you go back, what year would this have been? I should have wrote it down, but 2010, here we go. So here's this red line is the difference between 2010 rookie pay, and this is like draft position. And then here's the 2015 rookie pay. So I forget exactly what year in between then. They restructured, the league and the union said, all right, look, rookie salaries have gotten out of control. Some of these quarterbacks are making insane amount of money right out of college, and we know that the probability that they're successful is not very high. I mean, it's a crapshoot, right? We can't really pinpoint down. So now these teams are all hamstrung by having a lot of their money tied up in players who aren't even playing anymore. This is damaging the product that we're putting out there. Competitive balance is getting wildly out of control or wildly imbalanced. And so let's set some rookie minimums. They did, and you can kind of see that distribution of pay kind of lower. Right? So what maybe this process would look like. So maybe for the players, they don't really care, right? They actually want, and we'll think about here, maybe rookie maximums. So rookie maximum value contracts. So maybe the players or the union, maybe they don't care. They want it to be really high, right? So maybe they want it to be set 30 million. So both sides say, we need to set it, but we don't want to set it too low. And the teams come back and say, all right, well, we also don't want to set it too high. So maybe they would actually like 15. Right? So this is kind of they're both their desired points, right? But we can create what we'll call threat points, right? So even though they might have proposals, right, or some desired value amount that they would like to hit, they'd be willing to accept up to a certain amount, right? So maybe if we think about for the team or the teams or the league, when they're kind of coming to an agreement with the players or the union, they're really saying like, here, our threat point, if we're really going to be, and maybe they don't tell the players this, but they have some amount where they say, look, if you want to set a rookie maximum, anything past 10 million, we're not okay with it, right? Like I said, they might desire 15, but they really would be willing to accept 16, 17, 19.4, right? Any value, but as soon as the players come back with an offer that sets a rookie maximum above 20, they're like, that doesn't work for us. We're not willing to make an agreement past that point. And then, maybe the players union, if they're going to be really honest with somebody, they say, look, yeah, we would love it to be high. We'd actually love it to be as high as possible. We love there to be no limit set. But we really would be okay with anything over 17 million. We really would be willing to accept that. Right? So in this scenario, when both sides come to the table over time, right, they may make a proposal out here initially and maybe out here, and both sides say, well, look, those are way outside of our contract negotiation zone, right? But then over time, they kind of work their way back and maybe eventually get to a point where the union offers kind of an amount here, the league offers an amount here. Okay, we're getting closer. And then eventually we get to a point where we both agree upon, right? With some back and forth, really any value here, both sides could agree to, right? We don't know where exactly we're going to be in that range, but we know at least a contract can be made. Okay? The problem is if we had something like this, where let's say the players said, look, we're not going to take anything under 25, and the union said, or the league or the team say, we're not going to take anything above 20. Now what are we going to have here? Two potentials. What did we just have in Major League Baseball? A lockout or a strike, right? It doesn't, not necessarily, we don't know who it's going to come from this scenario. It really could come from either one because we're at a position where neither side is going to make a proposal that the other side is willing to agree to. Okay, so if we don't have any overlap in these contract zones, we might end up with a lockout or a strike. Okay? That's kind of the first way we can look at these contract zones. So any questions over that? Because I am going to complicate it a little bit. Okay. So just to clean it up, I'm going to draw this again just so I don't have as many things going on. So let's say, add what, 20 million, and this was 17. So, and then this was the union, and here was kind of our league or the teams. Okay. So let's say instead that one of these sides, so right now, there could be an agreement that's made, right? Somewhere in this range. But let's say the union is really pessimistic about the league. So prior to coming into this negotiation, the union says, well, look, the league has really been offering us some really low amounts, right? Because they don't truly know what the threat point of the league is. Like the union doesn't really, they only know their own, right? So if they're getting offers that are down here at 14, 13, 13.5 million, they might be really pessimistic about what the league would actually offer. And maybe based off of the offers the league has already made, they're actually pessimistic, and their beliefs about the league is that they actually won't accept anything over, anything over 16 million. Like they actually think the threat point for the league is much lower than what it actually is. So if the union believes this, what might they do? If they think it's 16 and the union's threat point is 17 million, they think there's no overlap. They think because of their pessimistic views, there's no way we're ever going to come to an agreement. So because of this pessimism, it could kind of lead us to seeing a strike by the union, right? These pessimistic views relative to what the actual values the league would be willing to accept might lead the union to just giving up before negotiations even start, or at least continue, right? If they've seen these previous offers already. Does that make sense? Any questions on that? That one's not too bad. The pessimism one is a little bit easier to think about. What if, and we're going to draw these same values out again, but I just don't want to put too many things on the same contract zone. This to me, drawing these contract, you can write this out, but I think using like a number line just always gives a better visualization. So let's say that instead, the union is really optimistic about what the league, I'm trying to say things and I'm trying to write. So this is the league here. So let's say the union is really optimistic about what the league would be willing to accept. And when I say optimistic relative to them. So what they believe is that their optimism might be that actually, from what we've heard, our optimism leads us to believe that the league would actually take anything below 25 million. So if I'm the union, I might propose something like, well, I don't want to like completely cap this out. Like I know that, you know, I want to make them still feel like they're winning, so they agree to this, or they don't try to come back with a counter offer. So maybe I offer something like 23 million, right? And my optimism leads me to believe they're willing to accept that, right? So in this case, what would the optimism lead to potentially? Well, if 23 million is proposed, what's the league say? It says no, and it probably now believes, well, the union, if they're proposing values out here, I mean, we might be way too far off, right? So the union's optimism might lead to the other side actually saying, well, we're not, you know, we're way too far away. We're going to remove ourselves from the contract negotiation table right now, right? So pessimism or optimism can potentially lead to a scenario where we see a strike or a lockout when there is a range of values where they could come to an agreement. And maybe some of this, like maybe some of these proposals, maybe it's not reflective of optimism or pessimism. Maybe it is a negotiating tactic in that, you know, they're trying to wear the other side down. But right, it could be that if we truly believe this, we do say, look, unless you reevaluate and can come up with a lower number, there isn't going to be a value that we can come to an agreement on, right? And that's probably what we've seen kind of relatively recently. I mean, look, if you truly couldn't come up with an agreement, 2 weeks prior, I don't think it's that you really reevaluated and found like there was an actual amount that, oh, we were actually, however far off and what we were willing to accept. It's probably something more about the optimism and pessimism of one of the sides. Okay, either the league believed, very pessimistically about the union, that there was no range that they would be willing to accept that they were going to offer, or maybe they were too optimistic and they were putting up proposals that were just a little bit too lofty of goals, right? And then, like I said, over a short period of time, maybe very quickly they realized like, oh, we're too optimistic, we're too pessimistic, and there was actually a range of values they could come to an agreement on. So, after a couple of weeks, the lockout was over. Now they are going to kind of continue the season. They came to an agreement. So that's the idea of contract zones, and we could have like kind of both different examples. So I use like rookie maximum here. You could use wages, like one the player and then the team proposing different wages, and the captain come up with an agreement in between. So when we're finding that monopsony and then that kind of monopoly or the union wage that they would like to offer, that would basically be, you can kind of think about our threat points, and then really anything in between there would be they'd be willing to accept. Okay? We could set this with different things like the number of preseason games. The union and the league have threat points. The union wants a fewer number of preseason games. The league might want more. And so it's a very similar thing, just a different application. Oops. So that's probably going to be one of the questions that you see on that homework, is something dealing with kind of this contract zone stuff. Okay. So are there any questions on that before we leave it here for a second? I don't think it's too bad. And like I said, I just think the visuals help a lot. So we talked about contract zones. What did I skip? I skipped some salary cap stuff. So this is, I won't waste a lot of time on this because I think it's kind of easy to think about. So let's say, I waste a little bit of time. We'll come up finish on it. So salary caps, not thinking about like salary maximums. So this isn't a cap on the total salary of the league, but here we're thinking about salary caps on individual players. So we know that overall players can only receive 49 to 51% of basketball related income, or if we at least look at the numbers. Salary is based off of experience. So, if we think about things like league minimums, so minimum amounts of money that players paid, they're usually a function of experience. That's how a lot of unions work. If you ever know someone who's in teachers unions, you're basically paid based off of your experience, right? How long you've been there. It's the same kind of idea. So if salary is a positive function or positively related to the years of experience, what effect would this have on roster, on the kind of average age of a roster? Who is this going to make more attractive? So let's think about it this way. And we can figure this out by looking at the labor market. So let's say I have two equally talented players, right? And let's say their supply, like their cost to supplying their labor, is exactly the same. So two otherwise identical players. And we've got the demand for their labor, so they're equally as talented, and they're trying to make a deal with the exact same team. So the demand for labor is going to be exactly the same. Right? So what's going to happen if, well, we should say, we had no monopoly or monopsony power, just to make this a little bit more simplistic, we can kind of determine what that equilibrium wage should be. Right? And maybe it happens to be that is exactly equal to whatever that the league minimum for a player is. Right? So they're being paid exactly how much the team values them, and it happens to be that we don't have to worry about not getting paid enough. This is above whatever the league minimum salary is, so it's not going to change. Well, then that was one player. We have the exact same quality player, the second player, but because they've been in the league for say 10 years, the wage that they would have to get paid, even though the value of their marginal wins coming from that labor is exactly the same, the league says, well, look, you actually can't pay them below whatever the league minimum is for somebody who has kind of 10 years of experience, right? So now if I wanted to get the same quantity of labor from that player who's been in the league for 10 years, I'm going to have to pay them above whatever their value is. So would I decide to sign that player? No, right? Why would my costs are going to be greater than my marginal benefits. And so we'll see teams kind of opt out of choosing to make deals with players who have more experience, especially if they're kind of lower quality players where I'm trying to kind of get away with paying them whatever this league minimum is. Right? So we should see the age of teams kind of go down a little bit after this rule or this kind of function was instituted. Okay. Any questions here? Okay. Now, if this player has a high enough quality, right, their marginal wins coming from labor is enough to shift the demand curve up, then it's kind of a moot point, right? It doesn't matter how many years of experience the player has. If their quality is high enough, we're never going to be coming close to hitting that league minimum. It would essentially become, so if you think about maybe the demand curve's way up here. So they were a higher quality player, but they still had 10 years of experience. Well, it doesn't matter. We can still get to that equilibrium point because the league minimum isn't going to be binding. So it really only matters for kind of players that are of lower quality here, where their wage could potentially fall below that league minimum. Any questions on this before I keep moving here? All right with that? Okay. And NHL kind of sets up the percent, so no one player can make more than 20% of their team's payroll. I just looked it up the other day. The NBA's is, I'll probably get one of these wrong. I think it's 25% for 0 to 5 years. No, that's wrong. No, it's not. 0 to 5 years is 25%. More than 5 up to 10 is 30. More than 10 years of experience, you can't make more than 35%, right? So if you think about someone like LeBron James, who has primarily been paid a maximum contract value, like whatever the maximum was, like most of his entire career, the first 5 years, his deal could only ever be 25% of whatever that total maximum payroll was set by the league, right? So you can go out and I just sent data to yesterday or the day before, and you can go through and find what the maximum salary cap was for the team for every single year in the NBA. And then you can determine what the maximum contract could be offered to one player, because it would be 25% of whatever that total cap was set to. And then if they've been in the league 6 to up to 10 years, they can actually be given 30%, right? And then after 10 years, they can be paid 35% of that total max, right? So once again, in this way, who would be optimal to have, if you're thinking about high quality players where we can think about a salary maximum here, but I do want to kind of come back to this question. So I forget after I draw this, remind me I have a question that's associated with this. So let's say instead we have this really high quality player, right? And so here's their supply curve for labor, and demand's way up here because they're a high quality player, and their equilibrium wage that they could be getting paid is this, right? However, there's a cap, right? Like maybe this is $30 million will be the equilibrium wage, but maybe 25%, maybe the payroll cap is set at 100 million. So any one player can only be offered 25 million a year. So maybe we've got kind of a price ceiling here. So this is a salary cap for kind of one player. Now what's going to happen is I either am going to get a lower quantity of labor from that player, or if I keep getting the same quantity of labor, what's going to be true? Well, I'm actually paying them less than what their actual value is. Okay? So for the team, this is a good thing. These salary caps allow me potentially, especially if there's intrinsic motivation for just the player to supply higher quality labor or a higher number of labor hours, or however we measure it, potentially these salary caps allow me to get a player and pay a player less than what their actual value to my team is. Okay? So what is better, to have a player who is young and has a wage that's above this salary cap, or have a player that's been in the league for a long time and kind of have their equilibrium wage be above the salary cap. So think about if that percent that they can be paid goes up over time. Let's say I've got, this is a player who's only been in the league for a year. So I can pay them only 25% of that total cap. Well, then after 5 years, that same player, let's say they've kept their quality consistent, right? So the demand curve for their labor is still the same, but now they're in their 6th year. Well, now, if I want to make a deal with them, right? Now they can get paid up to, what was it, 30%, as opposed to what I had down here, not 20, sorry, 25, right? And so now maybe in the 6th year, if I try to make a deal with this player, well, if this is a league maximum and here's their equilibrium wage, well, it's not binding, right? If you tell me you can't pay this player, more than 30 million, I would go, okay, I'm not, right? Like maybe their actual equilibrium here would be something like 27 million. And I kind of made this one easy. So 25% of 100 million was, oh, my colors don't match. So this was 25 million, but then after they're in the league for that 6th year, now the maximum salary that they could get is up to 30, right? So it's always kind of good to have these younger players who are really high quality, because I know that they probably deserve a wage that's going to be above whatever that cap is. And the longer they stay in the league, it's just less likely that those caps are going to be binding, right? Because that maximum keeps rising higher and higher. Does that make sense? Are there questions on that? So kind of both these things lead to, like, it's not just that having younger players is good because they're like physically younger, but the idea here that with all these pay implications are tied to their experience. And when I say younger, I'm really saying like the number of years in the league, right? So it's kind of one way to analyze these salary caps and the effects that they would have. Okay. Anything I want to say here? Oh, I do. So the NFL has been quite a bit different than some of these other leagues, and it kind of some interesting ways of paying players, and we can think about the implications. So they allow payroll to be varying percentages of all different types of revenue sources. So it's just not overall revenue or overall kind of salary cap. So there's no individual salary limit. You really can pay a player whatever as high amount as you want, right? And so if you don't have any individual salary limits, we're not thinking about like there's no per player cap, but they also allow these bonuses. And the problem is they go against the cap, right? So once I give a player a $20 million bonus, I have $20 million less to spend on the rest of my team, because we still have in NFL team caps on salary. There's no individual player cap, but there is a team cap, right? So I can, there is some, limit, and I have to have enough money to fill out the rest of my roster. I can't give it all to one player, right? But there isn't one in the sense that, I guess in a weird theoretical world, I could pay one player all of the salary and then just not have the rest of the team. Now, it doesn't make sense if my goal is to win maximize or even to profit maximize, but theoretically they could do that. So bonuses that are not easy to obtain, the NFL has said, though, don't count against the cap. So you used to see a lot of these huge signing bonuses because players love that, right? It's a good way to attract a player, because if they get, and especially in the NFL, if they get injured, right, that money is theirs no matter what. Okay. These not easy to obtain bonuses, though, are really attractive to teams because they don't count against the cap. So this might be something like a player gets, an additional $250,000 if they lead the league in sacks, right? Well, the team loves this because now instead of giving you, $250,000 signing bonus that goes against the cap, they can only give it to you if you lead the league in sacks. And even if I know you probably will, like let's say I have the best defensive end league, I know they're probably going to lead the league in sacks, or maybe I just set the number like if you get more than 10 sacks, I know that like the probability is like 0.999. So it's almost a guarantee. Well, it's still better to give that bonus through these performance-based bonuses, because now that money doesn't go against the cap. I am still able to kind of, it's not like I'm eating into how much money I can give to other players there. So we've seen these become really popular, right? And also maybe I would have given like a $250,000 signing bonus before, but maybe if it's tied to some performance, even if the probability is high, like 0.9, well, I know that there's a 10% chance I don't have to pay that player anything. So maybe I even say, okay, I'll actually give you $500,000 if you can hit this performance, metric. And yeah, I'm paying a little bit more, but even though I'm paying more, it still doesn't go against the cap, right? So it makes these performance-based bonuses really attractive to teams. But also, if teams are willing to give me a little bit more money, if I'm a player confident in my abilities, I probably like these bonuses as well, because teams are more likely to offer me a higher amount of money if it's tied to performance. And if I'm confident in myself, at least I feel like I have some control over getting that. And so this could also be, I've seen there's models you can build that argue this is a bad thing for players, because who's really going to be hurt in contract negotiations with these performance-based bonuses? So I just mentioned why players might like it, because the teams are willing to offer a slightly higher amount in a performance-based bonus relative to just like a signing bonus. And the players who are more willing to take these performance-based bonuses are players who are going to be very optimistic in their own abilities. However, the most optimistic will then be willing to take deals. If they're optimistic, that means their belief about themselves doesn't match reality, right? So a lot of players will sign these performance-based bonuses and then not hit the metric. Like they don't realize maybe the metric that league, like for instance, leading the league in sacks. Doesn't matter how good of a season that player has, it counts on other players not. And if they don't realize that, this may actually be a very low probability of occurring, even for some of the best defensive ends, right? Think about like, if you said, it was tied to winning MVP. Doesn't matter how great of a season you have. If another player has a slightly better great season, you just got paid nothing for that additional performance. So they're good, but players, if you were why am I blanking on this word? You make deal, you're a sports agent, right? You would probably want to like make sure your client knows like these are very risky, right? Especially if it comes to like leading the league and it's not just like a number on a chart. All right, I think that might be all. And we did the salary arbitration, so we'll pick up and we'll kind of talk about. We've already talked a little bit about this, but we'll keep talking about wages. We'll then transition into talking about discrimination and thinking about players getting paid wages below what their actual value is because of discrimination going on by the teams, by consumers, or even their fellow kind of teammates, right? And we'll kind of see how each of those would work, okay? So once again, if you haven't heard from me about your projects, I just want to make sure nothing slipped through the crack. Please email me. Also, when you email me, try to not do it through Canvas, because I think I was having some issues giving Excel documents that they weren't kind of going through Canvas okay. It's easier to send them like through your BSU email address, okay? All right, I'll see you guys on Thursday. Don't forget the online quiz will be due before we start class Thursday. Should show up in the next 5-10 minutes on Canvas.